And again, these issues that we're talking about are going to lead us into a civil war. So, while Congress was trying to solve this dilemma in the Kansas Territory, violence raged, and it gave the Kansas Territory the nickname Bleeding Kansas. And like I mentioned, Northerners and Southerners both rushed into the territory as fast as they could, and violence erupted. Now, during this fighting over slavery and fighting over disputed lands, whose is whose, because you just have a nightmare of a mess, more than 200 men and women were killed in Kansas during this violence. And it got so bad in the territory that what did they have to do? What did the government have to do? It got so bad, so violent, so nasty. Sent in the military. They sent in federal troops to restore order. So again, violence is raging in what people now call Bleeding Kansas. Northerners and Southerners rushed in to that territory as fast as they could, had differences of opinion, violence erupted, and this fighting over slavery versus non-slavery and whose land belonged to who resulted in the death of more than 200 men and women. And it got so bad and negative in that territory that federal troops had to move in and restore order. Now I'm going to give you two specific examples of the violence that occurred in the Kansas Territory. Two specific examples. And this is what led to the military having to come in. An armed pro-slavery group burned down most of the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was obviously populated with which type of settlers? If pro-slavery people burnt the town down, who lived there? Anti-slavery people. Okay, so this big mob of pro-slavery men went into Lawrence, Kansas, which was populated with anti-slavery settlers, and burnt the town to the ground. Well, what's that going to result in? Retaliation. And so the second example was a fanatical, which is a polite name for crazy, a fanatical white abolitionist. And an abolitionist is someone that would be for the abolishment or would not be for slavery. A fanatical white abolitionist by the name of John Brown gathered an armed group, including his own sons, and murdered 5 unarmed pro-slavery men in retaliation for the burning of Lawrence. So, in revenge, a fanatical white abolitionist by the name of John Brown gathered up a group of vigilantes, for lack of a better term, a big group including his own sons, and murdered 5 unarmed pro-slavery men in retaliation to the events that happened in Lawrence. Those two events eventually led to the United States government having to send troops in to restore order. It got so crazy in Kansas. Well, right in the middle of this, we've got another presidential election, the election of 1856. Now, prior to this election, we get another new political party that comes into being. And this new party, basically what you could consider were the Thomas Jefferson Republicans. So the Republicans are coming back in. Have they not been out a while? They're starting to make a move back in, the Republicans. And these Republicans that decide to take part in this election really come from Jefferson's philosophy, Thomas Jefferson's philosophy of the Republican Party. So, as a result of this, the Republican Party is going to reestablish themselves back into politics. Who's fading out at this point? The Whigs. And the Whigs are fading out. So really, there's only 2 major parties that will be represented in the election of 1856. You will have the Democrats and the Republicans. So we're kind of back to that game again. And the Whigs are the ones that are fading out. Well, the Democratic Party were big supporters of the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Very, very big supporters of both of those pieces of legislation. So the Democrats supported the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and they nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania for the presidency. So the Democrats, who were big supporters of the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania for the presidency. The Republicans countered with a name we talked about before, I think you'll remember. The Republicans countered with John C. Fremont. John C. Fremont. John C. Fremont. And he had an interesting little campaign slogan for the Republicans: free soil, free speech, free men, and who's the candidate? Fremont. Okay? Free soil, free speech, free men, and Fremont. That was the campaign slogan of the Republican Party, which ran John C. Fremont for the presidency. It was a fairly close election, but James Buchanan wins the election. He has 174, here he is right here, electoral votes, compared to 114 for Fremont. So James Buchanan becomes President of the United States, more famously known in history as the man that was president before Abraham Lincoln. So Buchanan wins the election, 174 electoral votes compared to 114 for Fremont. Now, this takes us to a subtopic that I almost guarantee it might be a question on the AP history exam next year, and that's the Dred-Scott decision. The Dred-Scott decision. Dred-Scott decision. Okay, on March 6th, 1857. On March 6th, 1857, the Supreme Court handed down what's known in history as the Dred-Scott decision. Okay, on March 6th, 1857, the Supreme Court handed down what we know in American history as the Dred-Scott decision. Does anybody in here know what that had to do with? I mean, I'd be pretty impressed if you did. Anybody know? Okay, I'll tell you. Dred-Scott was a slave who had appealed to the United States Supreme Court for his freedom. Okay, Dred-Scott was a slave who appealed all the way to the Supreme Court for his freedom. Now, obviously, if you are appealing all the way to the Supreme Court, you must have good reason or justification why you think you should be free. And here was the justification, or Scott's argument. He stated that he should be free because his owner had taken him from a slave state, Missouri, to a free territory, the Wisconsin Territory. So he believed because he was taken from a slave state, Missouri, and then moved to a free state, which was the Wisconsin Territory before Wisconsin became a state, that he should be free. Now, obviously, he went to lower courts, and it went up the chain of command, and because one lower court after another decided, one decided for Scott, one ruled against him, etc., because of all the controversy behind it, it ended up at the Supreme Court. And what do you know about the Supreme Court? Their decision is final. There's no more appeals. So one local court said yes, then they appealed that, and the next local court said no. And finally it got so controversial that it went to the Supreme Court, where the decision would be final. But the Supreme Court ruled that residents in a free territory and or free state had not given Dred-Scott his right to freedom. Okay? The Supreme Court ruled that residents in a free territory and or a free state had not given Dred Scott his right to freedom. Now think about that decision. It's kind of a little bit confusing, but the Supreme Court says that because he resided in a free territory or free state, that didn't give him the right to freedom. Now, what's the decision by the Supreme Court saying is if a slave goes to a free state, they can't be free. In other words, that person is not a what of the United States? Citizen. So, and then the ruling backs up the other court's ruling that said no, because think about this. So what he's saying is if Elise is a slave and she moves to Basin and they're free, she's not free because she started in a slave state. So if she's not free in a free state, she is not a citizen of the United States. And the reason they ruled against him was because if you are not a citizen of the United States, you cannot sue in state or district court, which got him to the Supreme Court. In other words, the point was you really should have never gotten to the Supreme Court because you didn't have the right to sue in state or federal courts because you're not a citizen. You got to be a citizen of the United States to sue in either state or federal court. So even though it went to the Supreme Court, you follow me? What they ruled at the Supreme Court level was that he had no right to the appeal to the Supreme Court because he had no right to even appeal at the state or federal. So that was a big decision. It was called the Dred Scott decision. Okay? All right. That'll take us to our last subtopic of the day before I talk a little bit more about the Dred Scott situation. And that's the emergence of Abraham Lincoln. Here comes Abraham Lincoln onto the stage. The emergence of Abraham Lincoln. And some of you that are in, well, our debaters are all gone today, but this, some of you might, that were in debate might get this. In 1858, a seat in the United States Senate from Illinois was open for election. In other words, Senator Stephen Douglas, who we've talked about, his seat came open. Could he run for re-election if he wanted to? Yes. Okay? But who had his eyes on that seat was Abraham Lincoln. And this is kind of interesting because this election, this Senate election in 1858, is really going to become a prelude for the upcoming presidential election in 1860. We'll explain that later. So, as I mentioned, the United States Senate seat from Illinois comes up in 1858, and Senator Stephen Douglas is going to run for re-election. No question about it. And he's a Democrat. Well, he really doesn't have any opposition within his own party. So he wins what I guess we'd consider the primary election without any problem. Well, the Republican Party was looking for someone to run against the very powerful Douglas to see if they could unseat him. And the man the Republicans chose was a very, at this time, little-known Abraham Lincoln. Not a lot of people knew about Abraham Lincoln 2 years before he became President of the United States even. Okay? So little-known Abraham Lincoln's going to run against Stephen Douglas, powerful veteran senator. Well, we'll tell you a little bit about Lincoln. You can write down what you want here. He was born in Kentucky. He grew up poor. He really received no formal schooling as a young child. He moved to Illinois at the age of 21 and joined the Whig Party. He first was a Whig, but because the Whig Party was going nowhere, he changed to the Republican Party. So he grows up in Kentucky. He's very poor, doesn't receive any formal schooling as a young child. He moves to Illinois at the age of 21, joins the Whig Party, and he actually gets elected to the Illinois State Legislature from the Whig Party in his early 20s. That would be like what Mike Greer is doing. He's in the Wyoming State Legislature, okay, Mike Greer. That's what Lincoln got elected to in his early 20s when he ran for the Whig Party. He became an Illinois State Legislature in his early 20s. Well, what do you normally run for in succession after that? If Mike Greer was going to run for the next political position, higher one, what might that be? The House, okay? And that's what Lincoln did. He ran for the House of Representatives. And he was elected. And he only served one term, and then he wanted to be elected to the Senate. And that's where we're at this point. So, Lincoln gets elected to the Illinois State Legislature when he's in his early 20s from the Whig Party. And that's what Mike Greer does. And then he went from there to the House of Representatives from Illinois. And then he set his sights on the Senate. And that's why he's decided to run against Stephen Douglas. Now, this was a pretty important Senate race. Illinois is a big state politically. And Lincoln immediately challenges Douglas to a series of debates. And everybody thinks he's crazy because Douglas is very polished, very experienced, great orator, can talk very, very well. And people look at Lincoln like he's out of his mind for challenging this guy to a debate. Well, do you think Douglas apprehensively or eagerly accepts the debate challenge? Eagerly. He's all over it. He eagerly accepts Lincoln's offer, and they schedule 7 debates from August to September 1858. They schedule 7 different debates. And people think that Abraham Lincoln is out of his mind to take on this very polished speaker in Stephen Douglas. Now picture this in your mind. You don't even really have to write it down. These two guys are like two opposite characteristics. Douglas is well-groomed, he's well-polished, big, stocky man, short, stocky man with this like bullish voice. Okay? Here's Lincoln, very lanky, tall, wears baggy clothes, not very well-groomed, his shoes are unshined, and he has kind of a high-pitched voice. You couldn't get more polar opposites in your life for this debate. And again, Douglas, well-groomed, polished, stocky figure, bullish voice. Lincoln, lanky, tall, baggy clothing, unshined shoes, high-pitched voice. Total opposites, okay? Well, the debates, all 7 debates complete, and Douglas goes on and defeats Lincoln for this Senate seat. So Douglas wins, despite Lincoln's efforts, okay? Now, you know, you can be a loser and still be a winner sometimes, okay? If the #1 seeded wrestling team in the state takes on in a duel the worst team in the state in that classification, and that #1 team wins 39 to 37, even though that team didn't win, they gained a lot of respect for going within 2 points of the #1 team. Okay, so you can gain a lot of respect from that. And that's what happened to Lincoln. Even though he lost this Senate election, he really established himself with his courage by challenging this seasoned Douglas. And he actually did pretty darn well in the debates. Not good enough, I guess, to win the election, but good enough to pave his way for a successful bid for the presidency just 2 years later in 1860. Okay? Really helped him establish himself for that presidential run. Okay, we're going to talk about, not today, but Monday, John Brown's going to get crazy again. And he's going to do a raid at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, and it's really going to set the stage for more conflict, and we're going to end up getting ourselves into civil war here. But we'll talk more about John Brown later. Then we're going to talk about the election of 1860, in which Lincoln's elected, and then we're going to talk about drifting towards war. But what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you a reading assignment that I want you to take home over the weekend. And you can work on it today if you want. And this is basically the Dred Scott decision. I want you to read through this. You can work together if you'd like. You got quite a bit of time. You can read through it, work together, and answer the questions on the back on the Dred Scott decision. Some of you might want to work together. Some of you might be better not working together when you're reading. I don't know. So we want to keep it kind of quiet in here and make sure that everybody has a chance to at least get a start on this. It will not be due Monday. We'll have her due the same day that you are turning in what? Your biography. Okay, we'll add it to the biography. That doesn't mean you should necessarily wait for the last minute. Okay, so that will be due by 4 o'clock on the 1st with everything else.